Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back, as is Katie Schaefer. Today we are talking all about Lisey's story, which is a name that I never knew how to pronounce until I was literally told how to pronounce it in the book by Stephen King. But Katie, you listened to the audiobook, yes?
I sure did. And it was read by Mare Whittingham, and it was very well done.
Nice, nice. Always a fun voice to hear.
Yes, and it's nice when the book is from a woman's perspective that we get to hear it read by a woman, in my opinion. I think that it's easier to get engrossed in it.
Because this story is very much rooted in Lisey's life, both in the present day and in the past. So you have two timelines here, and really it's her dead husband, her sisters, and, only a couple other people. It's not like this is a big ensemble book like It or something. It's smaller in scale in the same way that The Shining is.
Yeah, definitely. And that really works to its advantage. I mean, it's a longer book, but
Yes.
it means that we get a lot of depth with the characters that we're introduced to for the most part, except for like really peripheral characters who are more there to move the story along.
Yeah, and this came out in 2006. So 2006 was a very interesting year for King because we had Cell earlier in the year, which it's kind of a funky book of his. It's like his take on I Am Legend and The Walking Dead mashed together. And then there was the Desperation TV movie and the Nightmares and Dreamscapes TV series. And then this. So 2006 was a little up and down, I would say, for King. But this is one that I surprisingly don't hear a lot about, which, as I was reading it, I was like, this is very interesting. So I don't know why it's not one of his more talked about novels.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is. It's very well written. It's got a interesting plot that doesn't go in the places you expect it to go. It has this. The ideas in it are for King. They're really fabulous. Like with King's books, sometimes he has ideas in them, like with how he structures his stories that are just very savory. And it's like, oh, that's such a great idea. And the world of Lisey's story is very much that, I think, even though it is still pretty grounded in the real world.
I will note that even though you are told how to pronounce her name, I still kept saying it wrong in my head because it was always Lisey's story to me before I read the book. And that's just how I had always pronounced it every time I saw it on my shelf. So I was like, all right, got to break this habit here. But I did hear that this is one of King's favorite novels that he's written as well, which is why it surprises me that people don't talk about this one more, because it seems like some of his favorites are It and 11/22/63 from what I've heard in interviews and things like that. And to me, that makes sense. And it just so happens that both of those books are almost twice as long as this one.
Yeah, this one I thought was a good length for what it's offering. My guess is that this is one of King's favorites because it's a very personal book, and you get that sense from the beginning. I would say, even if you don't know the history behind it, because the whole thing came out of after he had the car accident or was hit by the van.
Right.
His wife decided to redo his writing room while he was totally unable to write. And so when he came home from the hospital, all of his books were packed up. And so the story grew out of the idea of like, well, what would have happened if I had died? And then it goes off from there. And Scott Landon, her dead husband, you can see a lot of King in him. He's obviously a character that King created, but there's lots of bits of Stephen King in that character, I say anyway.
Yeah, and he also dedicates the book to Tabitha, his wife, so you really can tell that it's going to be something that's a little more personal, because it's not like he dedicates every single book to her. He's dedicated them to different people over the years and decades, really. And so to see one that is dedicated to her, I think that instantly tells you it's going to be a little more personal than some of his other works, and it's not going to be quite as out there. It's not like this is something like the Tommyknockers or Dreamcatcher, and you do have this twist to it that comes later on, but the idea of a writer having a rampant fan base is no surprise, and King has probably experienced that. I mean, we're doing this podcast right now. So clearly, he
Right,
has a
right.
huge, massive fan base and people just really love his work. But some people cross a line that should never be crossed. And that is what this story is at its core, too. He's like figuring out what Tabitha would have done had one of his fans reacted this way.
Yes. And in the interview that I read where he talked about this, he mentioned that his wife doesn't really care for this book. And reading it, I can definitely put myself in her shoes and see why. Like, honey, I didn't really want you to write a book with a character that's kind of me. That's,
Yeah.
him putting her on the page and her sisters, because she does have several sisters, I guess. I can see where for her this might have been too personal, because I know if I'd been in that situation, I might have felt that way anyway. And because she edits his books for him, like she does a basic edit pass.
She's like the first reader.
Right. And then it goes off to his actual editor. So it's interesting that he chose to write this story and have it published because it is so personal. And at times it feels, especially as a big fan, and it talking about, I believe they call it parasocial relationships, where the reader feels like they know the author so well and the author literally has no idea who you are. And so it's very one-sided. And it feels a little voyeuristic at times to be reading the book because it feels like there's so much of him and her in the book.
I honestly would have never known that she had sisters if it weren't for this book.
Oh, yeah, me too. Yeah, and I only knew because in the article, he mentions that specific fact that, he includes the sisters because Tabitha has sisters.
Yeah, and he even might have mentioned that in like the introduction or afterward, whatever this book had, because I didn't read through the entire interview that you sent. I kind of skimmed through it and I was like, yeah, he was definitely, going for this what if vibe. And while I do really enjoy the story, I think maybe it's something that, I don't know if this is something that should have just gone in a safe and was for him and Tabitha alone or the family.
Right, because like I said, it feels voyeuristic at times, especially when it's her talking about her grief for him and the non-story parts of their relationship, the things that don't specifically play into the plot that's happening with these characters. Those little moments of where they're in bed together, the little conversations they have, and like all of their shared language. They have these special words and special phrases that mean something only to them. Like if you have a long-term relationship with someone or even like a close friendship for a few years, like you develop little bits of your own language, and learning that from someone else feels like too voyeuristic for me, I think. So in that part, I tried to just be like, well, okay, just look at this as if I didn't know any of that and just read it as I would a usual King book, because he does include that stuff in all of his other books where where these deep relationships are being examined, and that's the main anchor of the plot.
Is it just me, or did the past timeline almost feel like a eulogy to himself?
Yes, you mean with Scott's childhood?
Not necessarily the childhood part specifically, but just as Lisey's going through and remembering all of these events that happened with her and Scott, the moment under the tree and all of those different flashbacks. It almost felt like, I hope this is how my wife would feel about me after I was gone.
Yes, exactly. I agree. There is very much of that. And the love that Scott has for Lisey from her perspective is that's very beautiful. Like the core of their relationship, especially because they don't have children, so that their relationship is very much solely about the two of them. And 25 years is a long time to spend, especially going through him becoming this huge prolific writer. Then, she says Scott leaves her $20 million. Like it's a huge up and down changes in their relationship. And you get to see that the thing that carries them through all of this, especially since Scott suffered such a traumatic childhood and obviously has lots of trauma responses from that, is that's what held them together, is the love. And that really runs through the whole book. And that's also something that feels like is very much consciously and subconsciously part of why Stephen King wrote the book.
I'm glad you brought up his childhood, though, because I think that was an intensely brutal part of the book that I wasn't necessarily expecting out of this story. At first, I thought it was kind of going to be a marriage gone wrong thing. And in a sense, it is, because he dies and then all of these terrible things happen after the fact. But it's not that anything happened between the two of them to cause this.
Yes. And that's an interesting twist that, like, is the new idea in this story that works so well, because it's outside forces that are taking advantage of the unfortunate end of their relationship.
Yeah, and even outside of a marriage, anytime you're getting to know people at all, it's not like every moment from your childhood necessarily comes up. So the fact that he displays that within a marriage and it still isn't something that broke the marriage, I think that was really well done.
Yes, agreed. It works so well. And I think the story parts of it that are about Scott's childhood, which is where we get into the more fantastical edge of things and is the supernatural bit of this story. I think at first it was a little jarring when that comes in, because there's all those other things going on. And it doesn't come in until like a third of the way through the book. It doesn't really start getting into the reality of what happened to Scott.
Right. It takes a while. This book felt like a slow burn.
Yes, in a good way. Not like it sometimes can feel with a King book.
Yeah.
But because it sets up this intense relationship between the two of them and what Lisey's going through, 2 years on and trying to go through her husband's stuff and what's going on with her sister. She has this very normal life of trying to just get by on the day-to-day. And then all of a sudden, these wounds are reopened. And it plunges us into this really dark story of childhood abuse and anxiety and pain and everything that's going on in there, as well as his relationship with his brother Scott or Scott's relationship with his brother Paul. And it felt kind of jarring at first, but then he manages to blend it in really well. And so by the end, especially with how this book ends, it felt very satisfying. It had all been a setup to reach that ending point.
Yeah, and apparently Lisey has 4 siblings, and we really only get Amanda and Darla in this particular story. The others may be mentioned a little in passing here and there, but it's Lisey's relationship with Darla and Amanda that really push her present day storyline forward.
Yeah, I agree. And I liked how it portrays sisterhood and the characters. Now they all interact together. That felt very real as someone who has an older sister. And I liked Amanda.
Yeah.
She was a good portrayal of a character with a severe mental illness that doesn't stereotype or make it where the only aspect of her is her disease. She's still very much a full character who just has this part of her personality and this reality that she has to live with.
Yeah, I thought that was portrayed really well too, because it's one of those subjects that can go very, very wrong in a story. And
Yes.
King toes the line between having Amanda be a totally useless character at times, but then, she gets this redemption arc in the end, which I think is really good, because while that particular thing is not something that I'm intensely familiar with, it felt like her character would have these highs and lows even before this time frame for this story takes place.
Yes, I agree. That you get a sense of the history that's going on,
right?
That has been Amanda's life in a brief way. There's just a few little bits mentioned, but it's enough to sketch in a background and know that this current crisis that she's going through is by no means the first. It's just the most severe so far.
Exactly. And I didn't know what to expect going into this story because what I've been trying to do is for the ones that I'm not familiar with, I actually don't really read the descriptions of them. And I just kind of dive right in. And I've been finding that to be pretty entertaining because, like I said, I kind of thought this was going to be a marriage gone wrong thing because I did read the back of this book, but it doesn't give a lot away. It was kind of like, Lisey finds out about this terrible past that her husband had, and it's not what you think because it's the present day that's actually more terrifying for her than what happened in Scott's past, even though, his brother was killed by their father.
Right, but not the way you think. Like everything is not the way you think. Like even in that final scene where we find out what happened between him and his dad, which is, the final closure moment, it's not how you think. And it's all the better for being not how you think. It's not cheap. It feels more true and real and less like a fairy story.
Absolutely. So I think we should dive into talking about Zach McCool, as he calls himself.
God, that guy. I definitely have to say, he is one of King's most hateable villains, I think, when we're talking about villains who are just regular people in King books.
He really is, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that I think some of King's best villains are the ones you don't know a lot about. Obviously, you have ones like Jack Torrance, who you get to know very intensely throughout The Shining, but I think when it comes to these people that we're not necessarily going to be spending quote-unquote a lot of time with, it's better when they have sort of this mysteriousness to them. It's kind of like how we feel about the Man in Black.
Right. There's something going on there and that there's a deep story behind them, but it's not important for our story. All that's important for our story is that they're here and they're like this now. I thought of it kind of like the husband in Rose Madder. Like you get a little bit of his backstory more than we do here, but very little. And he's my other most hateable King villain, I think. And the two men feel very similar. They're grasping and abusive and demanding and complete psychopaths.
Oh, easily. And just the way that he's portrayed as when he's talking to her on the phone, you're kind of like, okay, there's something off. And then you get the mailbox scene.
Oh, God. And that's when oh, this is not good. This is going to be bad.
Yeah. It's going to go south very, very quickly. And you just can't help but notice that, I don't know, you can just tell that things are going to get very dicey. And it's not like Lisey doesn't have other stuff to worry about because she is very, very worried about Amanda. She's not quite as worried as Darla seems to be, but Darla seems to be a little more out of her element with understanding what Amanda needs.
Very much so. It seems like it's kind of an inconvenience for Darla. She's like, oh, God, just stop doing this. I just want to be on with my life. Whereas Lisey is more invested in helping resolve the situation in a healthy manner. Like Darla just wants it to be over with.
Yeah, she's like, I don't know what to do. The other sister is down in, Boston or something?
Yeah, Boston, New York, something like that.
And obviously, you mentioned earlier that 2 years had passed, but it's kind of like Lisey was still biding her time with going through some of Scott's stuff.
Yes, and I think that's very normal. It takes time to process these things. And with all of that, she's going through the grieving process. And for a relationship of 25 years, 2 years to me was like, I don't know how these people are expecting her to do this so quickly. It's only been 2 years. How is she's still adapting to, sleeping by herself.
I thought all of that was done really well because you feel her grief coming off of the pages.
Oh, God, yes. Yes, it's such a huge overarching sense of throughout the book. There's a constant grief and sadness, as well as that love that flows throughout the whole thing that affect her. You know, like she talks about how everybody says, I'm so sorry for your loss. They give their condolences. And she's like, he didn't die two weeks ago. Like, I don't need you to keep reminding me of this, because it's a painful reminder to get that, you know, like, oh yeah, he died 2 years ago. Like, I can see how that would grow frustrating, but it's, you know, you can't be rude to people when they say something like that. You know, okay, thank you. Yes, I appreciate it.
One of the other things I really want to talk about, because this is where I think Lisey and Amanda really get to shine, is when we get to the whole Booyah Moon section. And this is where the supernatural comes in, because King loves having a multiverse. And this is one of those things where, you know, earlier you mentioned Rose Madder, and she has the painting as a portal. And it works differently in this book, but it's the same sort of premise to get to this other place. And this other place is what is going to help you survive.
Yes. And you have to learn the rules of the other place. You have to be able to adapt and handle whatever it can throw at you. And I think for Lisey, it's not like with Scott where he's been popping in and out of this place forever. She's only been a few times, and now she has to really learn the rules or die, and possibly have her sister die as well. So she has to adapt so quickly and draw on all of the knowledge that she's just kind of learned secondhand from Scott's either ravings or stories he's told her or whatever. And it works so well, like getting to watch her figure these little puzzles out as she goes, because it seems like this book is a lot about puzzles, you know, with the bools, figuring out what's going on from piece to piece. And
the blood bools, I believe, is what they call them.
Yep. And then the fun bools, where you get the prize at the end. You get the drink or the candy or daddy's kiss, I think, is what the three things are. And it works so well in this book. And it's just like that it's all a setup from the very beginning was one of his more masterful author decisions and how he crafted the whole story.
The way this one unravels, you never really know what to expect, because Lisey is repressing some of these memories she had of Scott telling her about all of these horrible things that happened to him. So her memory is being triggered as all of these horrible things start happening to her. And I just love that juxtaposition there, the parallel where you have all of these things that happen to Scott, and then it isn't until Lisey is feeling threatened in a similar way that all of those memories of him telling her start coming back. And it's ultimately what saves her, because then she is able to enter Booyah Moon, which is just such a fun name to say.
It is. I liked all those little bits throughout this.
Yeah, I think some of these quirks just really made the story even better. And you know that, or you learn that Booyah Moon isn't necessarily a safe space. It's very dangerous still, because there is a monster that kind of patrols this universe. And that is exactly why Lisey wants to go there, though. And she knows the risk. She tells Amanda about the risk, and Amanda is like, we are doing this. We are getting rid of this creep. And it's very strange, because he wants some manuscripts or something that Scott had worked on and never published?
Well, it felt like by the end we learned that it really wasn't even about that.
Right.
That it was, you know.
But that's what he said when he first started calling her.
That's his given reason, you know, is to give that guy the king of or the queen of the inkunks, is I think what Lisey calls him, to give him the manuscripts for the college or whatever, which is just perfectly insane to me. Like, perfectly just wild that that's going to be your justification, and would in any brain think that these are logical steps to take to get this information to a college. Like, okay, you have lost it.
And you can tell he doesn't necessarily think everything through super, super well. He does have this entire plan laid out, and he's just hoping, in the end, from what I could tell, that his intimidation tactics will be good enough to work on her, but they don't. And I think that's what catches him by surprise.
Yes, she keeps him off balance because she doesn't react in the way he expects. Because I think, as is laid out a little bit when she's talking to one of the characters, like, he has this idea and perspective on her that is entirely based in his mind, not in any way reality. He doesn't know anything about Lisey. And he doesn't view her as a person. You know, they talk about her, I believe they use the word Yoko, which is just fraught with cultural connotation. And it feels like it's much more about that for him, about that she is what's wrong and he has to take his vengeance out on it. And it just doesn't, it's so foreign from the reality of the character that we know that it's really hard to understand his motivations until you get the backstory that we're given on him and his interactions with the professor who wants the manuscripts, and what she finds out about him from just their interactions.
Right. Another thing I loved was the bond that you could see between Lisey and Amanda, because as soon as Amanda found out about everything that was going on, she was like, oh yeah, let's go. Ready for an adventure. And even though when we meet her, she's not in the right frame of mind at all to handle something like this. You know, she's in a catatonic state. And to have her character go from that to being like, I will help you do whatever you need to do, really showed that sisterly bond that I think you can only have as siblings.
Yes. Yes. And I loved the scene where when Lisey goes in to help her goes into her Booyah Moon to help her come out of the catatonia. And we learn that Booyah Moon is different for different people who can go there. I liked that aspect of it. There isn't just one of them. It's, you know, your own personal place. And that gave it a different aspect. But then we get to see the true bond between Lisey and Amanda get to come shining forth when she helps her come out of that bad mental place.
Oh, absolutely. And there's one other element of Scott's history that we have not touched on yet. And, you know, we mentioned that his father killed his brother, but not in the way you think. And there is this family disease that all of the men seem to have, or most of them. And you get this story where Paul, Scott's brother, is killed by the father because Paul has succumbed to this disease. And then we have the twist that that's actually what Scott died from as well.
Yes.
And that he killed his father.
Yes. Oh, God. Oh, God.
So much.
Yes. And that the disease, and like, the disease doesn't kill him in the same way. It essentially kills Paul and his dad by making them completely lose who they are. You know, their bodies might still be moving around, but obviously the people within them were gone because they become these homicidal maniacs. But in Scott, it goes a different way. Like, his body just starts to break down because that's, I guess, what the disease does. But he never, you know, becomes that person. He never loses his mind and tries to kill Lisey or anything like that.
He definitely knows that there is a reason for everything that happened with his family in his past, even though it was something that was difficult to come to terms with, which I think we really see that in Lisey's memories of Scott. It just felt like he was someone who knew what had to be done, and he understood why his father did what he did, even if it wasn't easy.
Right. Right. And that shows throughout his character in the whole book. Like all of his preparations for Amanda, going and getting a place for her at the hospital and then setting up all of those little paths for Lisey to follow when things finally kick off into high gear. And you can see that he had a lot of foresight for what could happen. And he is obviously the one who learns from that very young age that you got to prepare and you got to set things up so that you can survive with these plans in motion. Because of that, he feels like he's still a live character in the book, even though we never see him in the present day alive, even at the very end when we see that final communication from him to Lisey.
This book was just so fantastic. I don't know that it's necessarily one of my favorites, but it definitely feels like it is top tier King that does not get talked about enough, like we were saying at the beginning of the episode. And, we still have a little bit of the ending to talk about, of course, because...
Of course, got to talk about endings.
Zach McCool definitely gets what's coming to him.
Oh, yeah. In the best way. I love it when the villains get those kinds of endings. Like, oh, so satisfying.
Yeah, and just because he gets what's coming to him doesn't mean that there isn't this tension and this fear when it comes to Lisey, because you don't really know if she's going to make it out of this.
Yes, and then she has to, I guess it's pay a price for using that creature to rid herself of Zach McCool's presence. Like, that I think, at least after the ending, I think this is still something that's going to affect her the rest of her life. But there's a good chunk of time between when Zach McCool gets what's coming to him and the end of the book where she's going back and forth between the two worlds, and she's experiencing the things that Scott felt throughout his whole life of the uncertainty around, what's he called? The Long Boy, the giant unknowable Cthulhu type monster that is an unknowable god, I guess.
Sometimes he puts stuff in his books and I'm like, this is just something I know absolutely nothing about.
Yep, exactly. And I think that's kind of what it's meant to be. Like the spider in It, like what exactly that thing really is and its origins and what it does, or the turtle or any of those things. Those are the next plane of the multiverse and unknowables.
Yeah, and how this wraps up is that she's finally able to go through his stuff, pack it up, and she thinks she's moved on, but she slips in and out of the different universes. So she'll be sleeping and suddenly be in Booyah Moon. She'll be awake and suddenly be there, and there's no rhyme or reason to it that we can tell. So we end this with her feeling like she's moved on, but she's still in not imminent danger, but there's this feeling that we don't know what's going to happen to her, because if she's asleep and slips into Booyah Moon and remains asleep in that universe, something could happen to her without her even knowing it's coming.
Right. It shows that danger. And I think, so there's the final scene not the final scene, there's the final scene with Zach McCool where her and Amanda then escape. And it feels like in an earlier time, King would have ended the book there. But since like the 90s, when I think there started to be more complaints about his endings, he continues it on and we see the effects that these stories have had on these people. But with this one, it works the best I've ever seen it, where we come to realize through that final little chunk where Lisey is slipping back and forth between the two worlds. And then when she finally decides to, okay, I can't live like this, I've got to figure something out. And she goes and finds that last thing that Scott left for her, the story of how and why he has to kill his dad. For me, it felt like the realization of like, yeah, that guy, Zach McCool, is a villain in this story, but the true villain is the curse or illness or whatever it is that has plagued Scott's family for generations that has now come and is now resting on Lisey, and her learning to deal with that and how to set it aside and separate herself from it is the true ending of the story.
Yeah, is there anything else you want to touch on before we start wrapping up here? Because talking about this has actually made me like it a little more than I gave it credit for after finishing it.
Yes, I did. There was a TV show that was supposed to come out this year that stars Julianne Moore, and King wrote all 8 episodes. So, like we've discussed, this is one of his favorite books,
I
and
think that is still planned too.
it is, and I think it's still in production. I think from what I had read, they had started production, and then the coronavirus happened, and they weren't able to finish it. But there's enough of it done that they've invested the money, so we'll get it. It is supposed to premiere on Apple TV and be exclusive, so that's cool. Not really.
And I will say that this was just announced in 2019. So the fact that we didn't get it just yet, given everything that happened in 2020, I think that's okay. That's not a super long time frame to where you're
No.
starting to get worried about it, like with, The Dark Tower on Amazon and the Dark Tower movie. And there are certain things that have taken years and years and years to try to get it off the ground. And there's always that, oh, well, I wonder why this keeps happening to this particular thing. But with this, I don't think that's the case. So that makes me very hopeful that we will see it either 2021 or 2022.
Yeah, when I looked today, the most recent projections were that we should see it in like summer of 2021 because they still have some filming to do. But with all the scripts written, like I said, there's all the parts have been cast. They've filmed some of it. We'll definitely get this as soon as they finish production, and production will be finished. And I'm really excited to see it because I think, especially because King wrote all the episodes and like the cast looks fantastic. Clive Owen plays Scott, and Clive Owen and Julianne Moore they were in Children of Men, I think it is, together. And they're both great actors, and I think they will bring something to this. It's enough that I might get, a 1 week free trial to Apple TV and then binge the whole thing.
Yeah, I honestly forgot this was on Apple TV, which I have because I have like all of the streaming things, apparently. Not all of them, but I do have a lot of them. And, J.J. Abrams is also involved in this. And
That's right. He's producing.
He was involved in Castle Rock, which I think Castle Rock was a little hit or miss with King fans, but I think that might be because they were just playing in the King universe and not necessarily telling these stories that came straight from the books.
Yeah, I agree. I think it was more if you're a King fan who likes that everything is all connected and you like to look for those juicy little tidbits. Like, I'm pretty sure that some of the cops that were in this are in Needful Things. I think they're like Clutterbuck, I think it is. I think he was in Needful Things and survives.
Yeah, and Abrams also worked on 11/22/63. So, he has a track record with King stuff.
Yes, and I think he, like I said, I think he's just producing this, and he's a good producer. I'm not as big a fan of him as a director, but I think he'll understand the importance of getting the money in the right places and spending it wisely.
Yeah, his production company, Bad Robot, has done a lot of good things.
So I'm really looking forward to it. And I'm really hoping, like we've talked about, this isn't a book that, it's 14 years old and it doesn't get a lot of love. Mm-hmm. I'm hoping that with a TV show that might reignite some interest in it and make people go back and be like, oh yeah, this is a really good King book. Not his usual stuff, but still really good.
Yeah, and honestly, I would say since, let's call it 2000, so that'll be 2 decades now, it really seems like the works of his that have stood out have been a little fewer and farther between. It's not like Carrie, Salem's Lot, It, The Shining, Dead Zone, all of those that came out within a seemingly short time frame. But it's like with the stuff in the last 2 decades, what you hear about the most is probably 11/22/63, Dr. Sleep. Under the Dome had its moment because of the TV show. And you have more recently The Outsider, the Mr. Mercedes trilogy. So those seem to be the big ones, and those are all the ones that have adaptations. So I do agree with you that I think some of these books might get more attention once those things come out, because it's not like this is the most rampant time period in the last 2 decades where all of these things are being adapted necessarily.
No, we're getting a slow trickle. And so it allows us, like you can really appreciate The Outsider, and then you can really appreciate Dr. Sleep. And so we get it's being played out enough that you have time to appreciate one thing. It's not like, oh God, what year was that? 2017, where it was like you got it. Gerald's Game, 1922, plus like 3 book releases that year, where it was just years of King insanity. Delicious King insanity, because most of that stuff was pretty great, but...
Yeah, and obviously they're redoing a lot of stuff. You mentioned it. There's The Stand that is out now.
That's right. That's right, on CBS.
Yeah, and so you're having this revival, but it's these stories we kind of already know.
Yes.
In a lot of ways, and Dr. Sleep being a sequel to The Shining, you have all of those ties there that people are already familiar with. So I think it's very interesting what hasn't been adapted from the last 2 decades. And obviously you have your kind of flops like Cell.
Yeah. Yeah. Not everyone can be a winner, I guess. But yeah, I think it'll be nice to see something like this that is more personal for him, and one of his stories that focuses on a woman.
Yeah.
Because I think we've talked before about how good he is at writing women characters and making them feel realistic and allowing them to be fully realized people. And Lisey is definitely one of those characters. So I'm excited to see her be given a chance at the big screen, especially played by Julianne Moore, because she'll give so much depth to this role. And I can see when I found out she was playing it, which was about like halfway when I was listening to the book, I was like, okay, I'm just going to put Julianne Moore in as my image of Lisey, and it worked well.
Yeah, it does. And to wrap things up with some ratings here, I mentioned, I kind of like this a little more after talking about it. And I think that's one of the fun things about talking about these, because once you read something, you're just going off of your initial reaction to it. You're not sitting with it and then rating it. So having been able to sit with this for a couple weeks before we recorded this episode and talking about it, I was like, okay, Goodreads doesn't let you do half stars, which is a thing that still drives me nuts. But I had, given it 3 stars and commented 3.5 stars. That's how I do my half stars basically in Goodreads. And I was like, you know what? I can bump this up to a 4. And I know some people have given this a 5 out of 5. And I totally get that now. Having talked about it, I was like, no, you know what? This was really good suspense.
Yeah, it had a lot going on that I didn't expect. And it wraps a couple of different ideas that King has played with before and made them new. And yeah, I think I would give this a 4.5 out of 5 because I really liked it. It's definitely it's risen to be like in my top 5, I would say, which is a crowded list.
Yeah, I'm waiting until I finish all of the books to kind of decide on that, because I have a general idea in my head of where everything is sitting right now that I've read so far. And there's a lot in the middle. I will say that.
Yep. There's a lot that's just like, this goes in the general, like, it's good. It's fine.
Yeah.
And then there's some real good outliers. And then there's the Tommy knockers, which is nobody's favorite. I don't know. Maybe there is. If there is, comment or something. But
and also we are thrilled for you.
Yes, it's great. Then you can appreciate it more than we did. There's some fun stuff in there, but it maybe should have been, 100-page short story and not a 1,000-page novel.
Yeah, that one was very long. But Katie, thank you so much for coming on to talk about Lisey's story. I'm glad I know how to pronounce her name now.
Yes, thanks for having me. It was a great talk.
All right, that does it for this episode of Chat Sematary. You can support the podcast on Patreon for $1 a month. You'll get a thank you on the show. For $2 a month, I will send you a Chat Sematary sticker. And if you want to follow us on social media, you can do so at Chat Sematary on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You could also rate and review the show. That's a huge help. And as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.